Hello everyone. Hello. During the last lecture, I think we have arrived up to here, up to the interest table. Let me repeat the interest table again because it is the most important part of this chapter. So first, into the first column, we write the year. Here we write the year. Then into the second column, we write the opening cash price. Opening cash price is the cash price remaining, which is the into the beginning of the year. Then we write the amount of principal. We know the amount of installment and we find out the difference between the two, that is interest. Then we show the closing cash price. Closing cash price is the opening cash price minus principal is equal to closing cash price. And depreciation has nothing to do with all this column. Depreciation is a totally separate column. We are just writing it here for our suitability. Next, difference between hire purchase and installment sale. Hire purchase transactions are regulated by Hire Purchase Act 1972. So, whenever we purchase the things from a shop, suppose we are purchasing a television set, then we may purchase it on installment basis also. But the hire purchase sale is different from that installment sale. Hire purchase transaction has an act. Proper act is there, Hire Purchase Act, which is established in 1972. But there is no such act for installment sale. Then possession. Into the hire purchase transaction, the possession is transferred, but the ownership is not transferred to the hire buyer, or we can call it hirer. And in installment sale, the ownership is immediately transferred. In hire purchase, ownership is transferred only when the last installment is paid. But in installment sale, the ownership is transferred immediately along with the possession itself. Third point is, in hire purchase, each installment is called as hire charge. And in installment sale, each installment is treated as the repayment of principal and interest. म्हणजे जसं काही आपण लोन घेतलेलं आहे आणि त्या लोनचं रिपेमेंट आपण करतोय असं इन्स्टॉलमेंट सेलमध्ये गृहीत धरलं जातं. आणि हायर परचेस मध्ये तुम्ही ते हायर म्हणजे काय, भाडे, तर ते हायर चार्जेस तुम्ही पे करताय असं म्हटलं जातं. Then in hire purchase transactions, the vendor can repossess the goods in default of payment. ज्या वेळेला हायर परचेसर जो आहे तो परचेसर एखादं इन्स्टॉलमेंट देत नाही, रिमाइंडर त्याला पाठवले, but still he is not paying the money to the hire seller or hire vendor, then the vendor has the right to confiscate that goods. he can repossess the goods because the ownership is in the name of the higher seller. The ownership is not transferred. But in installment sale, it is not possible. In installment sale, the seller cannot repossess the goods in the case of the default. He has no right to forfeit those goods. Next, hire buyer cannot sell the goods to someone else. Now, why the hire buyer cannot sell the goods? Because he is not the owner of the goods. When the last installment will be paid, then only he will be the owner of the goods. And then he can sell the goods to anyone else. But in installment sale, the buyer is the owner of the goods and he can sell the goods to others. So this much was this into this presentation. Let us see the next presentation. Next part, we are going to follow the full cash price method. The interest table we have calculated, that was on the basis of what? Full cash price method. This full cash price method is the most practical method for hire purchase transactions accounting. Now, why it is so? Because it assumes that the hire buyer is the owner of the goods or assets. Though he is not actual the owner, he will be the owner only after payment of the last installment. And this method records the asset at full cash price on the basis of substance over form. यामध्ये असेट जे आहे, जे प्रॉडक्ट तुम्ही खरेदी करताय, आता हे एवढ्या इन्स्टॉलमेंट बेसिसवरती जे प्रॉडक्ट खरेदी केले जातात ते प्रॉडक्ट्स म्हणजे एफएमसीजी गुड्स नव्हेत. एफएमसीजी गुड्स म्हणजे काय? आपण जे डेली लागणाऱ्या वस्तू आहेत, ग्रोसरी म्हणा किंवा कॉस्मेटिक्स म्हणा, हे सगळे जे काय आहेत हे एफएमसीजी गुड्स आहेत. हे एफएमसीजी गुड्स काही कोणी हायर परचेस ट्रान्झॅक्शन मध्ये घेत नाही, तर मोठे गुड्स घेतले जातात. मग उदाहरणार्थ ते कसली मशिनरी असेल, ट्रक्स असतील, व्हेकल्स असतील, टेलिव्हिजन सेट्स असतील, रेफ्रिजरेटर्स असतील, जे मोठे गुड्स आहेत, इलेक्ट्रॉनिक गुड्स आहेत, ते घेतले जातात. किंवा ज्यांना आपण मॅन्युफॅक्चरर्स गुड्स असं म्हणतो, जे मॅन्युफॅक्चरिंग करणारे कन्सर्न्स आहेत, त्यांना लागणारे गुड्स म्हणजे काय? तर त्यांना मशिनरी लागते मोठी मोठी. तर अशी मशिनरी वगैरे जी आहे ती घेतली जाते आणि ती फुल कॅश प्राइसला तिचं रेकॉर्ड केलं जातं. आता आपण पुढचा भाग बघूया. द एंट्रीज इन द बुक्स ऑफ हायर परचेसर अँड हायर वेंडर. हायर परचेसचं अग्रीमेंट केल्यापासून एंट्री सुरू होतात, ते तुम्ही शेवटचे इन्स्टॉलमेंट पे करेपर्यंत त्याच्या एंट्रीज ज्या आहेत त्या चालू राहणार आहेत हायर वेंडरच्या बुक्समध्ये. आणि हायर परचेसरच्या बुक्समध्ये सुरुवातीच्या एंट्रीज ह्या इन्स्टॉलमेंट पे करेपर्यंत असतीलच, पण त्याबरोबर नंतर डिप्रिसिएशनच्या एंट्रीज ज्या आहेत, जोपर्यंत त्या असेटचं लाईफ कंटिन्यू असणार आहे तोपर्यंत त्या एंट्रीज कंटिन्यू राहणार आहेत, डिप्रिसिएशनच्या एंट्रीज. राईट. So let us start with the first entry, that is of purchase of asset. So whenever you purchase an asset, that asset is the product. The higher purchaser purchased it from the vendor, right? That product comes into your business, comes into your accounts. So that asset account will be debited, and who is the another party? Higher vendor is the another party. You have not paid the full amount to him yet, right? So that's why the entry will be passed for the amount of full cash price, and that's why this method is called as full cash price method. When you record the first transaction, that is the purchase of asset, you record it at full purchase price, full cash price. This was the entry in the books of the higher purchaser. Now the entry in the books of the higher vendor. Vendor means the seller. What will be the entry? his party is that higher buyer and he has made the sales, so higher buyer account will be debited and his goods has gone out, right? So higher sales account. Then second, down payment on signing the contract. When the goods are purchased, both the parties comes into an agreement which is called as hire purchase agreement. Right. Now, at the signing of this agreement, the hire purchaser will give some amount of that full cash price to the higher vendor, and that amount is called as initial payment or down payment. Why it is called as initial payment? Because it is paid at the initiation of the transaction, that higher purchase transaction. So this payment initiates your transaction, that's why it is initial payment. Now you are going to pay to the higher vendor, hence his account is debited and the money is going out. You are paying from the bank, so bank account is credited here. Then in the books of higher vendor, now the higher vendor receives the money, so bank account is debited, and who is the giver? The higher buyer is the giver, so his account is the credited, and the entry will be done for the amount of the down payment, or you can call it initial payment. Next, interest due at year end. At the year end, you have to calculate the interest and you have to make entry for that. Interest is the part of your installment. You are going to pay the every installment according to the agreement, and in that installment some amount is included of interest and remaining major part is of principal. So we are going to pass the entry for interest. Interest is the expenditure for the purchaser. So interest account is debited here. And whom you are going to pay? Who is the beneficiary? Higher vendor is the beneficiary. So his account is credited. So that entry is done for the interest due at the year end. Now in the books of higher vendor, you will pass the entry like that, because interest is what? Here income for that higher vendor, right? And who is paying this interest? Higher buyer is going to pay the interest. The amount is due from him, so his account is debited to interest account. Now this amount of interest will be calculated on the remaining cash price. Now, in the first year, what will be the remaining cash price? The total cash price is here. Out of that, some down payment you have done. Suppose full cash price is 5 lakh rupees and down payment you have done 50,000. Then the remaining amount will be 4 lakh 50,000 and you will calculate the interest on rupees 4 lakh 50,000. Do you understand this? Let us go ahead. Fourth entry. Fourth entry is for payment of installment on given date. It may be year end or it may be a fixed date in the middle of the year. Then on that date, you have to pay the installment. Who is going to pay the installment? This buyer is going to pay the installment. To whom he is going to pay? He is going to pay to the vendor, and hence vendor account is debited. And he is going to pay through bank, so bank account is credited. Now here the amount of installment and which includes principal and interest, both things are included here, so you don't need to pass a separate entry for payment of interest. See here what we have written into the last slide. Interest due we have written, not interest paid. This is not interest paid entry, this is entry for interest due. Now whatever due interest is there, it should be paid. Here we are paying the interest in this entry itself. Though we are paying here installment, it is amount which includes the principal also and interest also, so there is no separate entry for payment of interest. Let us see what is the situation in the books of the vendor. Vendor is going to receive the money. Whenever you receive the money, you will debit the bank account. And who is going to pay this money to you? The higher buyer is going to pay this money to the vendor. So buyer's account is credited. Again, the amount will be the same. Installment amount will be recorded in the books of hire vendor also. Now, next two entries are only in the books of hire purchaser because it is supposed here the owner of the goods is hire vendor, hire purchaser only for depreciation entry, not for all other entries. For all other entries, who is the owner? Hire vendor is the owner unless and until last installment is paid. So how to record? How do we record the depreciation? We debit the depreciation account and we deduct this amount from the asset. That means we credit the asset account. So depreciation account debit to asset account. Suppose a truck is purchased, then what we will write? Depreciation account debit to trucks account or to vehicles account. Then amount of depreciation will be calculated on full cash price. Remember this word. The amount of depreciation will be calculated at a given percentage at full cash price, not on higher price, not on higher purchase price. It is calculated on full cash price, right? And there will be no entry in the books of hire vendor because the goods are in possession with the hire purchaser. Third entry. This depreciation in the books of hire purchaser should be transferred to the profit and loss account of the hire purchaser. At the year end, this entry will be passed. The depreciation recording also will be at the year end. So profit loss account will be debited and depreciation account will be credited. So we know this entry already. Both the entries we are known. In 11th standard you have learned this entry, and no entry will be here because there is no depreciation in the books of hire vendor. So there is no question of transfer of that depreciation. Then last entry. Last entry is about the transfer of interest. Now for hire purchaser, interest is the expenditure. So it will be transferred to the debit side of the profit loss account. Right? Then in the books of hire vendor, this interest is the income for that hire vendor and that will be credited to profit and loss account. So entry in the books of hire purchaser is what? Profit loss account debit to interest account, and for amount of interest which is paid to the hire vendor. And in the books of hire vendor, entry will be interest account debit to profit and loss account, and it will be for amount of interest received to him from the hire purchaser. Now what next? There are not only 7 entries, these 7 entries will be repeated. First 2 entries. What are the first 2 entries? First entry is the for purchase of asset and second entry is for wait. Second entry is for the down payment. So these 2 entries will not be repeated, but every year interest due entry, this one, then installment payment entry, then depreciation record entry, depreciation transfer entry. These entries will be, and transfer of interest entry. This transfer of interest entry. These entries will be repeated in the books of hire purchaser. And the entries for the same transaction in the books of hire vendor will be repeated unless and until the last installment is paid. ज्या वेळेला लास्ट इन्स्टॉलमेंट पेमेंट करून होईल त्यावेळेला काय होणार आहे, तुमची हायर परचेस प्राइस सेटल होणार आहे. म्हणजे सगळंच्या सगळं पेमेंट हे कम्प्लीट होणार आहे. ते झाल्याच्या नंतर ह्या एंट्री ज्या आहेत त्या बंद होतील. आणि हायर परचेसरच्या बुक्स मध्ये मात्र डिप्रिसिएशनच्या एंट्रीज या कंटिन्युअस राहतील. लेट अस सी the points to be noted while making these entries. Depreciation is transferred to profit and loss account debit side every year in the books of hire buyer. Then interest paid is transferred to profit loss account debit side every year in the books of hire buyer. and in the books of higher vendor, interest received is the income, so it is transferred to the profit loss account credit side in the books of the higher vendor. Then we have to show the extract of balance sheet also sometimes. What is the extract? The part of the balance sheet which is related to our question only, that should be shown into the asset side. Now how we will show it? We will record that asset at full cash price and we will deduct the depreciation out of that. The balance of asset will be shown in the balance sheet asset side as WDV every year in the books of hire buyer. The balance amount of hire purchase price will be shown in the balance sheet on liabilities side as unsecured loan in the books of hire buyer. हायर बायरच्या बुक्स मध्ये काय करायचं आपल्याला, जी रक्कम तो त्या वेंडरला अजून देणं बाकी आहे, उरलेली रक्कम हायर परचेस प्राइस पैकी उरलेली रक्कम, तर ती रक्कम त्याला दाखवायचे अनसेक्युअर्ड लोन या हेडिंग खाली लायबिलिटीज साइडला. Then the balance amount of cash price will be shown as debtors in the books of higher vendor. आपण हे बघितलं की उरलेली रक्कम हायर बायरच्या बुक्स मध्ये काय नावाने दाखवायची आहे, अनसेक्युअर्ड लोन्स नावाने दाखवायचे. या उलट आता हायर वेंडर जो आहे त्याला पैसे येणार आहेत, त्यांनी सेल केला होता, मग सेल केला होता आणि हा उधारीवरचा सेल झाला, म्हणून तो काय करणार आहे, डेटर्स म्हणून तो आपल्या बुक्स मध्ये असेट साइडला जी उरलेली कॅश प्राइस आहे ती तो दाखवणार आहे. सो या पद्धतीनं आपल्याला हायर परचेसच्या एंट्री ज्या आहेत त्या करायच्या.